So welcome to our next installment of Wisdom, O Wisdom, Where Can It Be Found? And we are continuing in our journey through the book of Proverbs of Mishlei. We're now going to turn to chapter 5, and we'll take a look at this interesting manual and curriculum and try to determine what exactly is going on, whether there is a recurring theme, a structure, specific questions or observations that we have. We'll get a chance to explore that together as we continue to build this curriculum for teaching and the transmission of wisdom together. So there's Bev, welcome as well, and to Marian, welcome. Good to see everybody. So let's begin together with chapter 5. And as is our custom, we'll read it together, both in the Hebrew, paying attention to the sounds and the words that we see that are repeating, as well as in the English translation. So I'll ask you just to join me. Everyone can join in for a few verses. I'll ask everyone to do 4 verses, and I'll call you on our Zoom room together. So let's begin with chapter 5. I'll go from Shirley to Alan to Marian to Bev that I can see in my screen to Goldie. Okay, so 4 verses each. Let's start with that. B'ni lechochmati hakshiva letunati hat oznecha.
My son, hearken unto my wisdom, incline your ear to my discernment.
Lishmor mezimot v'dat tzvatecha yinsoru.
To guard cunning, so that your lips may keep knowledge.
Ki nofet titofna siftei zara v'chalak mishemen chika.
For the lips of a strange woman drip honey, and her open mouth is smoother than oil.
V'acharita mara kala'anach chada kecherev piyot.
But in the end, she is as bitter as wormwood, sharp as a double-edged sword.
Great. Okay, Alan. Ragleha yordot mavet she'ol tza'adeha yitmochu.
Her feet go down to death. Her steps take hold in the netherworld.
Orech chayim pen tefales na'u magloteha lo teda.
No path of life she traces, but her pathways wander and she knows it not.
V'atavanim shimuli ve'al tasuru me'imerefi.
And now, O children, hear me, and do not swerve from the words of my mouth.
Harchek me'aleha darkecha ve'al tikra vel petach beita.
Keep your pathway far from her, and do not approach the entrance of her house.
Great. Marian. Pen titen la'acherim hodecha ushnotecha la'achzari.
Lest you give your glory unto others and your years unto the cruel.
Pen yisbe'u zarim kochecha va'atzavecha beveit nachri.
Lest strangers sate themselves with your strength and your toil in the house of an alien.
Ve'nahamta ba'acharitecha bichlot bsarecha ushe'arecha.
And you moan in the end when your flesh and body are consumed.
Ve'amarta ech sanetei musar b'tochachat na'atz libi.
And you shall say, how have I hated reproof and my heart despised rebuke?
Wonderful. Bev. Lo shamati bekol morai u limladai lelamadai lo hitatati oznai.
Neither have I hearkened to the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear my instructors.
Kimat hayiti bechol ra betoch kahal ve'eda.
Soon I fell into every sort of harm in the midst of the assembled crowd.
Shte mayim miborecha v'nozlim mitoch be'erecha.
Drink water out of our own well, running water from your cistern.
Okay, that was a typo. Sorry, it should be from your own well. Yafutsu ma'enotecha chutza berchavot palgei mayim.
Let your springs spread into the street, streams of water in the squares.
Great. Okay, Goldie. Yehiyu lecha levadecha ve'en lezarim itach.
Let them be only yours alone and not for strangers alongside you.
Yehi mekorcha baruch, u'samach me'eshet neorecha.
Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the women of your youth.
Ayelet ahavim ve'ya'alat chen dedeha, yaravucha v'chol et ba'ahavata tisge tamid.
A lovely hind, a graceful doe. Let her breasts ever satisfy you. With her love be ravished always.
Okay, wonderful. Arthur, we're on 20. Velama tishge b'ni bezara v'techabek chek nochreya.
So why, my son, be ravaged with this strange woman and embrace the bosom of an alien?
Ki nochach enei Adonai darchei ish v'chol maglotav mefales.
For the ways of a man are before the eyes of the Lord. He traces all his pathways.
Avonotav yilkedunu et harasha bechavlei chatato yitamech.
The crimes of the wicked shall ensnare him. In the cords of his offense is he held.
Hu yamut be'ein musar berov ivlato ishge.
He shall die for lack of reproof, and in the greatness of his folly shall he reel.
Okay, sorry about that. I just got a little bit of an interruption. Did you finish that verse, Arthur?
I did, yeah.
Okay, great. All right, so this is a bit of a strange chapter, to say the least. There do seem to be some things that are repetitive, but there's also some things that are just quite strange, or as Alan mentioned, somewhat opaque. And that's always our challenge, to overcome what we call the cultural incommensurability of these texts. When they were spoken orally to those who were listening, it was much more clear what was being spoken about. The metaphors and the imagery were much more clear because they were more current, and we're thousands of years away from when they were spoken, and as a result, it's a bit of sometimes of a challenge for us to figure out what exactly is being referred to. But let's try to go through some of this together. Any specific questions about the opacity, and then things or themes that you see, questions or comments about what we're looking at so far. So we'll go around the Zoom room. So Goldie, and then Alan.
I think in some of the previous chapters as well, that in their time, they were very concerned about young men being seduced by women from other tribes, let's say.
Mhm.
These women were supposedly seductresses, and they really feared that these men would succumb to them and leave their own group and be swayed to either join or be influenced by other tribes of their time.
So is this a new theme in the Hebrew Bible? If we look
No.
at the grand arc of the Bible?
I don't think it's a new theme, but they seem to be repeating this a lot. Like they really seem to be very concerned about this.
There's a lot of anxiety, but it's something that we also see, for example, in the prophets, and even in the
Right.
book of Deuteronomy, right? There's the fear
Right.
on a tribal level that
That's
the
right.
Israelites will, as the language in the Deuteronomy texts suggest, that we recite in the Shema regularly, guard your eyes and guard your heart so that you do not go whoring after other gods. So the idea in antiquity was that there were cults of the goddesses in Near Eastern society, pagan fertility cults, and they were a real draw for the Israelites, and the prophets were always speaking out against that. So that's an ancient theme,
Yes.
but now it seems to be that anxiety is been transposed from the prophetic period into the wisdom literature itself, and maybe also into the landscape of the city and the urban context, which maybe is a little bit different than some of the earlier agrarian anxieties, but the anxiety is constant. That's true. So we'll have to dig into that and understand why that's relevant to wisdom, because that's really the question. It's clear that there's some anxiety, but what does it have to do with wisdom? Okay, and Alan had his hand up.
Well, I have two comments on this. After reading chapter 5, I noticed that there's a dichotomy in Mishle, especially the way you've shuffled the chapters. We are introduced to the woman of valor, then we were introduced to the adulteress, and now to the strange woman. So that's the first thing that I've noticed. The second thing is that my takeaway from this chapter is that this is an argument in favor of monogamy. Based on the way the argument is set up, that it's more advisable to maintain one's intimate relationship with one's wife rather than with the strange woman.
So why is it's a good observation about the dichotomy between these two aspects of the feminine, and that keeps coming up throughout the book. So that's important to keep in mind. Why is the argument for monogamy relevant to wisdom?
Because according to our sages, it was a preferable state to be in. I think it reinforces the family life, which is sort of the essence of Judaism, and straying from family life perhaps might weaken whatever it is that social structure with which we pass on our wisdom from one, or our religion from one generation to the next.
Right. I think it's a really important observation. We've mentioned that a couple times, but you've articulated it very well, that there is a parallel here between the metaphor of the family and its structure and its soundness, and the structure of community. And wisdom that is transmitted within the family is only successful under these conditions, and wisdom that's transmitted in community is only successful and transmitted under these conditions. So they're being used as metaphors for the successful transmission of wisdom. What are the infrastructures that we need, both in terms of relationships as well as kind of like an institutional framework? If we call the family or the community an institution, what is it that we need in order to ensure that wisdom can be transmitted? And you look at the different metaphors, so that one of them is a marital metaphor. One of them is also more about water, in terms of the wells of water. We'll take a look at the water imagery as well. It's all coming back to this same theme and this concern, the anxiety and the hope for being able to transmit wisdom without it being interrupted, disrupted, or destroyed. Bev, and then I think Marianne had her hand.
I'm going to borrow. Yes, I'm on. Sorry. I'm going to borrow from something I learned yesterday from.
What chapter are you on? With Professor Robinson.
Exactly. So the metaphor that comes to me again is God's relationship to the people of Israel. So a same sort of thing. You've got to avoid the strange woman, avoid the woman who's going to lead you astray. Basically coming back to the relationship with God and making sure that that's sound. So that just sort of jumps out at me here.
Well, I think that's a good rabbinic move, Bev, but that's not in the text. So that's a good drash, but it's not in the text. That's the way, for example, the rabbis would read the Song of Songs, which is an erotic love poem, and they would say, through their Targum and their translation, they'd say, well, actually, it's an allegory for the love of God to Israel, but that's not what the text says. So on a pshat level, on the contextual level, we're still at the first level. You've already jumped to the second level of allegory and exegesis, which is great. It's a very interesting read of it, but it's not, we still haven't figured out the first level yet. Okay. So understand how we're operating in different levels of interpretation, but that's definitely a valid rabbinic shift that happens. It happens in Kohelet. It happens in Song of Songs. Whenever there's a text that appears to us to be quite strange and somewhat disturbing, the rabbis will always bring it back to an allegory between God and the people of Israel, or an allegory about studying Torah, which was their project. So that makes a lot of sense. Okay, Marianne.
it's very interesting, the structure of this chapter, because the first thing that came to mind for me was Dante's Inferno.
Why?
Because you've got, first of all, in chapter, in verse 10, you've got the toil, you've got the inferno, you've got the flesh and the body being consumed. It's almost like Dante took his structure of so the flesh and the body consumed are the purgatorio, and then the springs and the fountain at the end of the paradiso. It's almost like you could take this as a blueprint for Dante's whole.
Well, Dante would have definitely been familiar with scripture, so Proverbs would have been something that he would have been familiar with. And there is the shift, you're right, from the toil, though, doesn't seem to speak about specifically the fires of Inferno, but that would have been Dante's own imagination. But there is the sense of, we'll have to talk about the water, the imagery of the water in verses 15 and 16, and in relationship to the decomposition of the body. Yeah, so those are important themes. I'm sure that would have influenced him, and as well, yeah.
But sorry, my question really was about some of the metaphors which has sort of been touched on already. That the woman of your youth is not specifically something we've seen before. It's not specifically Eshet Hayim.
Yeah, this is as Alan was saying, this is the antithesis. This is the stranger woman now. So the woman that we're looking at here in the Hebrew, she's referred to as the Isha Zara, and her body parts are referred to often, like her lips are Zara as well, right? So there's something strange and foreign, and seductive and dangerous that provokes anxiety here.
Is there a connection between that and when we're talking about pathways and 21, and also connection with 23 with the lack of reproof, so that the pathways all of a sudden, before the pathway was always prescribed as to the way your foot would go and how it would feel and where it would land, and now pathways are a multitude of possibilities rather than something ahead of you that's prescribed.
Right, that's part of the concern, right? Is the metaphor of straying from the path, or last time, as Shirley said, of going off the derech. Here, in 21, it speaks about, and this is specifically gendered now. It's saying that a man has specific paths or ways, derachim, and God is able to see and to trace all of those paths, and it's by the influence of the wicked crowd that you become ensnared in these cords, right? The cords of your offense are what hold you to be stuck in that pathway. And the concern, and in a sense the caveat, or the warning that's given to the student here, is once again that if you don't follow Musar, that is the ethical pathway, this ethical guardrail, then you will die, and the greatness of your folly shall you reel. So there's a real concern that this is a life or death matter, the acquisition of wisdom, right? That's just to bring it back to focus. That's what we're concerned about. A couple things as well to think about. Those are all good observations. I want to look at a deeper dive into two verses, 5:18, and then if there's time, 5:19, which are again quite strange verses to try to figure out what exactly they might mean in terms of the transmission of wisdom. In 5:1, where we speak of this need to hearken unto wisdom and to incline your ear unto discernment, and then all the way moving into this description of guarding your lips because you may be seduced by the lips of a strange woman who drips honey, and her open mouth is smoother than oil. Again, this to me brings up the imagery of the wily ways of the snake in the Garden of Eden that we have spoken about together. But remember that the snake in the garden is the symbol of precisely of what I call this wily wisdom. And so whether it's the symbol of the snake or the symbol of the woman, the strange woman, these are interchangeable symbols that we see in the process of trying to find the right pathway back to the tree of life that we've been introduced to a number of times. And so that's something that is important to take note of. As well, remember, we have encountered, because we did a little bit of a fast forward, and we've already looked at chapter 25 and as well and parts of 16, there is a reference to honey as being dangerous. Remember the dangers of overindulgence in honey? And we talked a little bit about that as first of all, wisdom and the pursuit of knowledge as being symbolized by honey, because it is golden, it is luminous. And if you encounter someone whose lips can drip with honey in her lust for love, as is the case between the lover and the beloved in the Song of Songs. If you look at Song of Songs 4:11, it's actually positive, right? Lips to be dripping honey, notfot titotfena sifte zara, is the negative rendition of this. But when we look at the Song of Songs 4:11, there you see that there is a positive way of looking at lips that are dripping honey. So it's considered to be an erotic simile that actually is positive in the song. And here in Proverbs, it's negative, right? Because this seduction doesn't lead down a good path. The seduction in the Song of Songs leads to the affirmation of life and of the world and of the landscape of Eretz Israel. And ultimately, it affirms the love story between the Shulamite and the shepherd, which is considered to be positive. But here, this is, as Marion said, this is an example of love going astray, or eros gone astray. So we know that in the 25th chapter, we're going to return to look at the symbol of honey and understand how it's used figuratively as a metaphor for wisdom. And honey, once again, remember we talked about it. What happens if you eat too much honey?
Get sick.
Yeah.
That's right. It's an overindulgence, right? It's you can't have too much of something sweet. It makes you sick, right? You vomit the honey. That's what Proverb says later on in a couple of the places. And that's why it says in 25:27, to eat too much honey is not good. So to be sparing of speech is honorable. So in chapter 25, it refers to honey as a metaphor, not just for wisdom, but for wise speech, right? To be wise with the words that we use, not to overindulge in the pursuit of wisdom, and not to overspeak. Okay, so that's another sign of wisdom. Sometimes it's about just being able to be silent. So that was something that comes up later in chapter 25 and 20 and chapter 16. But here, honey is used as a sign of seduction that will cause the disciple to stray from the trusted pathways for the transmission of wisdom. When we look at this section, verses 15 through 20, what do you notice? Is there a theme, or could we say this is a discrete kind of a section within this larger chapter, that something is going on within 15 through 20? Do you notice a theme or a recurring series of images that might point to a theme? Because sometimes you have to look at the clusters inside of the collection. Even within the chapter, there may be sometimes we find there are clusters.
Well, this is where the metaphors get very opaque.
Okay. They do. So Alan, let's drill down. Why is it so opaque for us as moderns when we get from 15 to 20? What are we struggling with here?
We're struggling with the fact that there is a referral. The topic of the strange woman refers to an erotic relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And I think from 15 to 20, there's a suggestion that drinking water of your own will is almost like finding your sustenance within your own family. Look inside.
Right, because why is that, Alan? That's very good. What do you know about the agrarian reality and the bore, the well? What happened in ancient Israel with the bore? How was a house set up?
I believe the well was the first thing that was set up. I'm sorry, I have to plead ignorance. I'm guessing here. It's been many years since I studied that.
No, but you're right. If you look at the way that in tribal society, the way that houses would work, or domesticated abodes would work, is that they would dig a pit in order for there to be either a full-fledged cistern or just a more shallow well to collect water because you needed water to survive, right? That was
Yes.
essential. And then there are all kinds of litigation issues that come up, which is not discussed here, but just to show how prevalent wells were in terms of damages, and the whole issue in early rabbinic literature about nazikin, specifically relating to torts, oftentimes happens with situations where something fell down a well, an object or a person. So these wells were always there. It was sort of part of the landscape. Okay, wells were also in the opening books of the Pentateuch. What purpose do wells serve? Twofold purpose for wells.
It was a meeting place.
That's right. That's right. And today we would call them what?
Water cooler.
Yeah, the water cooler or the watering hole.
Yes.
Right. Today, when
Yes.
people go to meet people, when we were still able to do this before the lockdown, we call it, I'm going to go meet up with someone at a watering hole, meeting at a bar, but or it could have been at the water cooler. So in antiquity, this is the place where, for example, many shidduchim take place and happen. Moses,
That's right.
Zipporah, they'll meet together at the watering hole. Rebecca and Isaac. It's a very important place
That's
of
right.
communication between genders and tribes, right? For example, the situation of Moses and Zipporah, which we're entering into now in the Torah reading. What tribe does Moses come from, and what tribe does Zipporah come from? Remember the scene, she's watering her flock, and Moses comes to help and to protect her when she's being taunted by some other shepherds. So where is she coming from, and where is he coming from? And then what is it about the power of the well that allows them to meet? Because normally they wouldn't be meeting up. The tribes would be separate unless they were at war, or if they were engaged in some kind of commerce. But the only other place that they would meet was be at the watering hole,
That's right.
primarily. So where does Zipporah come from? What tribe? Does
The
anybody remember?
Midianite? Was she
That's
a
right.
Midianite?
She was, because her father Jethro was the
That's
priest
right.
of Midian,
That's right.
and these were actually considered to be in the later books of the Pentateuch that Moses knew well and is attributed to have written. These become one of the 7 nations that are the arch enemies of the Israelites. So it's interesting how not only does he meet with Moses, who is an Egyptian in guise, but Hebrew by birth, comes to a watering hole, meets a Midianite, mingles with her, eventually goes back to meet the father-in-law, and then marries her and integrates the two families in terms of their political power and their religious power together, and this becomes the Israelite tribe. So that's an interesting moment that we don't expect, and our expectations are sometimes inverted when you come to the watering hole. So some strange things happen when you come to the watering hole and you come to the well. Now, here in Proverbs, perhaps there's a little bit of that resonance, because there may have been some anxiety about Moses and Zipporah meeting from different tribes. That's one anxiety that comes up depending on the period within Judaism. But here, to drink water out of your own well, running water from your own cistern, this also has some other kinds of meanings. Alter suggests that the association of the well with female fertility, and especially with the womb, is reflected once again in the Song of Songs, throughout the Song of Songs, and it's recurrent in these betrothal type scenes. Right. So as I mentioned before, the watering hole is the place where we see the encounter of many of the patriarchs and the matriarchs coming together to meet and ultimately to be betrothed. And it's the place where the young man encounters his future bride by a well. So that was part of the pshat of the landscape of what it meant to speak about a well. Aside from being able to give water to your family, it's a place of meeting, an intersection of cultures, and potentially the cross-pollination of wisdom between tribes. But the pure waters of the well are, in this case here in chapter 5, antithetical to what other liquid that we just read about?
Honey?
The honey.
Honey.
Right. So we have the purity of the water of the well is antithetical to the sweet and smooth, the sweet honey and the smooth oil of the seductress's mouth. Right. So this is an important juxtaposition that comes up now. And of course, both of these substances are also metaphors for knowledge. Okay. So in this case, if you want to transmit and to receive pure and appropriate, fructifying and constructive knowledge, you turn to water. And if you want to take on and to transmit and to receive seductive, wily, corrupt, and contaminated knowledge, then you would go for the honey. And here, what we already know is that what is another metaphor for Torah. Torah is said to be the Eitz Chaim, which we learned about earlier. The sages
Yes.
then also take from here specifically that Torah is known as what kind of liquid?
Mm. I don't know.
It's Ma'im Chaim. It's
Oh.
said to be the living waters of Torah, sometimes is the way that it's referred to. Okay. And that's something that is important to remember. In general, what I was trying to point to in 15 to 20, it is its own kind of cluster, that to teach your child or a disciple the value of true intimacy with a life partner is no small feat, and there is a certain wisdom that comes with that. And one of the commentators suggests that in wisdom and with wisdom, wanderlust finds its direction and destination. So we need to be in a place of wisdom. We need to be committed to a relationship, as Alan said, of loyalty towards this path of wisdom. And then whatever it is, wherever our wanderlusts will take us, we find that we can be directed towards the destination of the tree of life. And we spoke together about the overlap between the family and the community. That's the recurring theme here again in Proverbs. And in many ways, this section sort of feels like a manual of desires. What are we supposed to do if we want to be able to direct our desire towards a constructive destination? And I thought this brought to mind for me a different way of looking at manuals. So we have a manual of desires here, at least in chapter 5. We've seen a little bit of that same repetitive direction in the opening chapters. It's very different, for example, than a contemporary manual for living with defeat. Do you know who speaks about a manual for living with defeat? Probably not a really good general, but do you know who from Montreal once said that and sang that recently? Leonard Cohen. He talks about looking at life as a skeptic and as a pessimist. His approach to wisdom is much more skeptical and pessimistic than we see in Proverbs, but he's also struggling to find coping strategies to deal with life's endless series of sufferings. And he proposes that his songbook is a manual for living with defeat. Proverbs, even though it's anxious, is suggesting that you can do something with desire that will not lead to defeat, because we're going to overcome these errant pathways and make our way back home, as opposed to Leonard, who I think was wandering, trying to find his way back home for the duration of his journey. But what I think is interesting is that by contrast, this manual of desire in Proverbs is really meant to cultivate, to prune, to galvanize, or if we want to use the metaphor of water, it's to irrigate and to make sure that in the process of irrigation, the water of wisdom is a constructive energy for uplifting oneself, for family, and for society. So that's the cluster of 15 through 20 that I think is operating here. I want to take a look just for another moment at an interesting deeper dive into verse 18. Now that we've said that water and that Torah is Ma'im Chaim, let's look at verse 18, which says, "Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the woman of your youth." Now, if you were going to look at this verse and to I want to just actually make one more comment before I go to 18, because I think this is just again to show you how prevalent the influences of Proverbs, and we don't even know it. We don't recognize how prevalent it is. So before we get to 18, if you look at another verse, 16, which we didn't talk about, Yafutsu mainotecha chutza. Okay, so there's a few versions of this verse that happen in wisdom literature. Let your spring spread out into the street, or outwards. Now, does that verse bring with it any associations in the contemporary period for you? If we again are saying that 15 through 20 is associating water with Torah. If there was one sect of Judaism today that is most likely to turn to a verse like this to justify its missionary posture in the world, who would that be, Bev?
But
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
So the Alter Rebbe used this verse as his calling card for the project of a mass missionary movement. I'm using that in a positive sense, even though missionizing is something that is ambivalent and sometimes negative in Judaism. Here, it was used in a positive way. The idea was you must, and this comes from a teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, that the Messiah will come once you disseminate in the public sphere all of your teachings. So Yafutzu mainotecha chutza, if you speak to any Chabadnik, that is their program, and it's their calling card, it's their mission statement, right? So synagogues have mission statements, right? This was the mission statement of Hasidism that started 7 generations earlier than the Alter Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, of blessed memory. It started with the Baal Shem Tov, who never wrote down any of his teachings. Remember we spoke about this? This is a very interesting quandary. How do you publicize and disseminate all of your teachings so that the Messianic era will come if you're never going to write anything down? That's the first challenge, okay? 7 generations later, Chabad comes up and has one of the most aggressive and effective dissemination machines called Kohot Press in Brooklyn that is a publishing machine and is pushing out all of these Hebrew, Yiddish, and English translations of these works like never before. And the funding mechanism that supports it is inspired by this verse, that you must do everything that's within your power to let the springs spread into the street. Let the springs of Torah spread into the public domain. That's also the reason why, for example, that it wasn't just for publicizing the miracle that Chabadniks would go light Chanukiot in the public square, but it was part of a larger missionizing posture that comes from this, that whenever you would engage with them in the street becomes the place where Torah must flow like water. So I wanted to point that out because, again, this is another example of the abiding influence of over 7 generations in the Hasidic world that culminates with Chabad, that turns to verse 16, and we'll use that as the way of justifying the missionary posture. If you were to ask others, like for example the historian David Berger, about this missionizing posture, he's an Orthodox Jewish historian of Jewish history. He would have a very different perspective on what Chabad is doing and how they do it, but it is a messianic mission that they have been deployed to achieve based on the Baal Shem Tov's reading of this verse, and then the way it was later interpreted by Menachem Mendel Schneerson. So I think that's something that's interesting to appreciate, right? We say these verses are opaque, Alan, and it's true, and yet look at what one half of a verse can do to the entire world and to Judaism at large, right? We cannot underestimate the power of the influence of that half of a verse. I think we could all agree, right? It's a very, very powerful verse. Now, I want to take a look at another half of a verse in a different register, 5:18. Let your fountain be blessed. And this is a real Yeheh Mekorcha Baruch. And we're going to just skip the second part because sometimes the interpreters are only interested in one part of it, but we cannot obviously ignore it. The focus really is on the first part, Yeheh Mekorcha Baruch. Now, in complete juxtaposition to the Chabad model, which is missionizing to go out, Yehem Mekorcha Baruch, is a posture that a different Hasidic sect takes in Boisbriand to become insular and turn inwards. And I want to show you how that works with this one half of a verse. Okay, so the Chabad model was to go outwards into the street, to missionize outwards. And this model that the Tosher Hasidim use, again, it's from the same book, it's from the same chapter. You have completely different mission statements in terms of what they're doing with this verse. And again, it's interesting to see the influence of this verse in terms of the transmission of wisdom, as well as the institutional structures that that support that vision. Okay, so let me share with you the way that the Tosher Rebbe reads this verse, let your fountain be blessed, and let's try to appreciate and see if it's true that it's either inward turning towards being more insular, or does it mirror the outward turning missionizing of Chabad? I'll let you be the judge. I sort of gave you a little bit of a hint already where I think it's going, but I'll share with you just an excerpt from one of his teachings that I just translated. So this is the way that Tosher Rebbe reads this part of the verse 518. When a person dedicates all their strength and vitality to matters of business and commerce, then when it comes time for study and prayer, for Torah and Tefillah, the person no longer has strength or the proper frame of mind to be able to study and pray anymore. Behold, this kind of dedication of resources, that is, putting all of your resources in commerce and in business, if you put all of your energy into that, the Tosher Rebbe says this is an act of stealing. It's a very strong language. So again, wisdom teachers use provocative language. How could he say that you're stealing? Well, he says what you're doing is you're stealing. It's an act of Gnevan Gezela, stealing your God-given resources to study and to fulfill the commands. Now look at what he does with this, and let's think about, is this insular or is this missionizing outwards? And so it is the case when a person exempts themselves from being occupied with Torah study because one has already dedicated spiritual energy to the service of prayer, right? So that is now stealing from the time that you were supposed to dedicate to Torah study. These are two competing modalities of Jewish life, to study Torah and to pray. Now, if you're consumed with commerce and business, you don't have time for any of it. So that's the first category that he's criticizing. Then he goes on to the next category, which is inside this insular setting, that he sees people in his very tight-knit insular Boisbriand community, and some of his Hasidim are either coming late to prayer services, or this because they're spending too much time studying, or they're coming late to study time because they're spending too much time praying, or they're coming late to both. In any event, if you don't show up according to this curriculum, if you don't show up to the allotted time for prayer and the allotted time for study, you're stealing from each, which means that and if you think about it, it's an interesting presupposition, which is to say you only have a certain amount of focus in the day. You only have a certain amount of energy that's both cognitive and spiritual to dedicate to the tasks that need to be done in the midst of the day. And if you are allocating that limited energy that you have, call it 12 hours a day, if it's all dedicated to making a living, which is a noble thing, the rabbis already suggest you have to do that, then what do you do with the rest of your time? If you're trying to dedicate time to Torah and to Tefillah, he's concerned that he sees certain patterns of behavior within his religious community where people are stealing from one activity and putting those resources of energy into another, and he calls that thievery, which is very strong and provocative language. So he goes on, he suggests, I sort of summarize it, but just to go back to his language, he says, this applies also to the case where one delays prayer because of studying Torah, right? You spend too much time in the yeshiva, you're engaged in a really interesting moment and chapter and verse in, let's say, the book of Proverbs, and it goes way beyond the allotted time. And now you are stealing time that was supposed to be dedicated to prayer. And the same thing as well, he says as well, and he has another case, a scenario. He's looking around in the prayer hall, in the prayer room, and he says it also applies to stealing time from prayer if you're in the midst of prayer and you open up another book and start studying, which I admit I'm guilty of. I do that all the time. He's saying, well, that you're a thief. You should not be studying Torah while you're praying. For some people, studying Torah is a devotional activity. I see that as a devotional activity, so I allow it to enter into aspects of prayer life. And we know that the proper prayer practice in the morning begins with a compulsory small amount of study, after which Rabbanan Kaddish, the scholars Kaddish, is recited. So he's taking a little bit of an extreme critical perspective here, but he's saying that you can't multitask. If you come to pray, then pray. If you come to study, then study. But you start stealing one modality of engagement and allotting it to the other, then you're going to be multitasking. Because he says the time allotted for Torah study is separate from the time allotted to prayer, and a person has to serve each sacred task according to its allotted time. So he's very concerned and anxious about how his Hasidim are going to be using their time and structuring the course of their day. Let me just conclude, and then we'll take a question. Let me just conclude the final idea, because I want to bring it back to the verse, and then we'll take questions. And then he says, similarly, it was due to the sin of thievery that really defined the generation of the deluge. He's talking about Noah's generation, that because they were thieves, that was the reason why the decree was sealed to flood the world. So this is a surprise to me. I didn't know they were thieves. I thought they were involved in other forms of debauched behavior, but he's saying they were thieves, and that's what sealed the deal to flood the world. And so it is when one augments good qualities, right? So the generation of the flood, he's saying, augmented their behavior with destructive qualities. He's saying on the flip side, if you build good habits, then you can be guarded from the sin of thievery and keep yourself away from wandering into what he calls the dust of thievery. And then your good habits can sustain the world. That is, through this kind of acting in the world, this is what will allow the words of prayer from the afternoon service come into fruition when God said to Abraham, V'heyeh bracha, and you shall be a blessing. And now he's going to close it and bring it back to the opening verse, which is what we're waiting for. This means that we shall become a fountain of blessing, wherein every fiber of our being is blessed, as indicated by the verse in Mishlei, Yeheh mekorcha chaim. Yeheh mekorcha baruch. Let your fountain be blessed, and so shall the sacred energy flow from the fountain of blessing unto us all. Amen, if it be your will. So that's a very interesting and creative way of reading this. Before we go to the questions, I want you to first answer my question, which is, compared to the way that we saw the earlier verse that was used as Chabad's mission statement to missionize, do you see this as being a mission statement to go outside or to go further inside of the community? It feels like Shirley's saying inside.
Yeah.
Right? It feels like it's directed. This is very much directed to the inner core of the community, and it's assuming that you already have this practice, right? It's sort of at the beginning, it talks about someone who's immersed in commerce all day, and of course there have to be a few macharim that support the community that probably are immersed in business to support the Bois Briand community, and that may be a part of it, but the rest of them are depending on that commerce to sustain the community. So he's suggesting you have to be careful when you do that. But then he goes right into the world of the study hall and into the place of prayer and says, this is what I see on the inside. And now, as a wisdom teacher, I'm going to give you my reproof. This is my tochacha for the behavior that I think is leading to the potential discontinuity of the transmission of wisdom. So I brought you those two very divergent examples to show you within chapter 5 how a half of a verse becomes a mission statement for a movement and within communities within the Jewish world. So we've got a couple questions and comments. Yep, Shirley and then Goldie.
So I was looking at the two of them, and what struck me was that Ezra in Babylonia was trying to come middle ground, because he brought the Torah to read in the marketplace. on Monday and
which was a very radical thing to do at the time, right? How
Right.
could you take a holy scroll out of the temple precincts, out of the sanctuary, so to speak, and you bring it to the marketplace? So how is Ezra a middle ground, do you think?
Well, I think he brought it where the people were. And so then he brought it and so that the people would hear, right? And we
Mhm.
talk about hearing. So, and that people would learn from the hearing of what was being read on Mondays and Thursdays, because those were market days.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then hopefully would move people to learn from that experience, to hearken to the wisdom that they were hearing, and use that, as we've talked about, as Bev said, as the guardrails of life.
Mhm.
So I think it was really quite something, and it was through him that we were sustained in Babylon.
Right. Right. That's a very good observation. That project of, it's not necessarily missionizing, but it's bringing Torah to the people and bringing it to them in terms of where they are. That was very important in terms of sustaining the people after they were coming back from exile. Because on a certain level, what was the problem that they had when they returned from being in exile in Babylonia? What was the educational challenge that he was facing? Do you remember? What do you think would have been the problem if you were in exile all these years?
Literacy of Hebrew.
What's that?
Literacy of Hebrew as much as anything else.
Right. So they're losing their language of literacy, and they're becoming disconnected from the Torah. It's not clear how much of the time people still were dedicated to knowing, learning, speaking, and studying in Hebrew. Because what was it that was the lingua franca of Babylonia?
Be Persian, Farsi, wouldn't it?
Well, Farsi would have been what was spoken in the elements of the government and within Zoroastrian religion. But for the Jews, what would they have spoken?
Aramaic?
That's right. That's right. So that's the lingua franca of business and of trade. And it also then becomes later on the language of the Babylonian Talmud. Right. So there was a concern that the Jews were becoming disconnected from the source, Yeheh Mekorcha Baruch. How can your source continue to be a blessing to you if you're so disconnected from it? So Ezra said, go to where the people are and make a compromise. Many in the priestly class were shocked by what he was doing, to say that it was possible to bring the Torah out into the marketplace for the people to hear it. But clearly the wisdom concern is very much this one, that if you don't hear and learn the Torah, and if it only remains a museum piece, then there's the concern about discontinuity, right? So Ezra is a good example of probably one of the first ones who at least started to bring out the Torah a little bit towards where people were at, long before the Hasidic movement many centuries later did that as well. Good. So we had Goldie and Marion and Bev.
What I was going to ask about this Tashuv Rabbi, what is their relationship to Maimonides? Because he was another person who believed in a middle ground, that a person can participate in commerce and business and still spend time studying Torah and praying.
Well, it's a good question. Obviously, Maimonides is a medieval philosopher and physician who was very adamant about finding that balance. It's a balance. It's a balancing act and disagreement that already emerges in the Talmudic period, where the sages were trying to figure out how much time do you spend making a living and how much time do you spend studying and praying. So it's an ongoing debate that they were having. The medieval period, Maimonides becomes very much a proponent of finding a trade within or a craft within your life in order to be able to support yourself. And in addition, he became the greatest philosopher of the Jewish people. So clearly he was dedicating a lot of time to studying and to thinking. He just didn't sleep that much, but he was trying to find a way to allocate those resources of time and a frame of mind that comes from the rabbinic period, which had a certain concern that then reaches a fever pitch in the Hasidic world over how you spend your day. That project of a daily regimen of practice is something in all spiritual traditions that have a sense of continuity and transmission is a serious question. How do you spend your day, right? And
Right.
that's something when you go into each of those, like in the Jewish world, each sect and each community has their own way of allotting the resources of the day in order to be able to make it a time that is propitious for the transmission of the shared values and of the wisdom. And that affects the way the institutions are structured that support it, as well as the curriculums that that inculcate it. So who else was there? It was Marion and Bev.
Rabbi, is it too simplistic just to say that maybe the difference between the two approaches is one of trauma? Because it makes me think it's a very parental position that the Tosha Rebbe is taking, and it makes me think of there's a certain parenting technique out there that says that your child must eat at a certain time every day and sleep at a certain time, and part of it does teach discipline and balance in the life, but it also just makes the child feel safe
because of trauma.
Yeah.
Well, it's very interesting that you bring that up. I never thought of that, but the story of the Tosha Hasidim is very interesting. Their village in Nir Tosh in Hungary was completely decimated by the Nazis, and the only remaining descendant of Tosh was able to come through some spectacular feats of immigration and sponsorship to come to Montreal, and basically saved the Tosha Hasidim from complete oblivion. The same thing happened with Satmar, and you look at it now and you see how much each of the, in terms of the demographics and in terms of the institutions and in terms of the dissemination of their library of knowledge is remarkable in the face of the trauma that each of those specific sects faced in Eastern Europe that were otherwise would have been decimated by the Nazis. So there are some who suggest that, for example, especially in Satmar, but also in elements of Tosh, that there is a lingering element of trauma that if you were to sit them down on the couch, do a little bit of psychoanalysis, it would reflect an educational program that is strongly influenced by trauma. So I think you're onto something there for sure. There's definitely that element that's there. The anxiety is not just an anxiety that you're going to forget your lesson, but it's the memory of Nazi genocide that fuels a deep part of their subconscious curriculum. So it's there. Okay, Bev?
Just an observation that you have two different models of how to grow Judaism. So one says, you bring people in no matter what they do, if they're Jewish, without trying to convert anybody, but you bring people in no matter what, versus you just grow from within. And the only reference points become other Tash. We grow families and we keep insulated. We don't care if the outside world understands us. We grow our own.
Right. No, they're two very different models that are interesting, and it's worth a lot of reflection. I would just suggest for further reflection, if you're interested from a sociology of religion perspective, that there are two good places to look. One of them is the book that I mentioned by Philip Wexler. That's I think it's called The Social Vision of the Rebbe. It talks about Chabad and its spread throughout America as this project of Yafutsu Mayanot Chutza, of spreading and taking the water out into the street. And now we have our first critical study from the sociology of religion that actually was put out here and edited by Professor Robinson, called Les Juifs Hasidiques de Montréal. It's a very interesting, it's one of the first serious studies of Montreal Hasidic sects, and there's a huge section of it that's been dedicated to analyzing the sociology of the religion of the Tosha Hasidim. And it begins to look at some of these issues that we're talking about. And I think that if you're interested in the evolution of religion in general and Judaism in specific, and how, for example, what happens in Montreal is different than what happens in New York, which is where the basis, I mean, it's kind of ironic because Boisbriand is the headquarters for Tosh, but they're also in, they have Kiryas Tosh as well in Borough Park. And in the same way that Chabad is based at 770, it has outposts here in Montreal. So it's kind of reached a point now where it's difficult to necessarily localize it, but that's where they began. And where those stories began, the verses they used and the regimens that they have tried to inculcate in the curriculums they've tried to promote, they're interesting because it shows us different visions of Judaism. And I think that's one of the things to take away from this chapter, is to think about what does it mean to transmit wisdom, the wisdom of Judaism. Is there one specific modality that works best? And think about the way that you work best as a learner as well as a teacher, in terms of the Judaism that you've learned and the Judaism that you want to share with others. Is it about looking inwards, or is it about looking outwards, or perhaps there's even a third way that we haven't even talked about yet? But I just gave you those as two extremes to think about in terms of the process of the transmission of wisdom. And I think it's a wonderful way to end, to say for all of us, Yeheh Mekorcha Baruch. May the source of your wisdom that sustains you always be a blessing to you, to your true self, and to your families, and to your friends, to your community, and to the world. That's really where it all comes back to. In many ways, it's always inside out and outside in. So may it be a blessing, and God willing, we'll return together next week, and I think we'll take a look probably at chapter 6 together. So be safe and sound, and take good care, everybody.
Yashar Koach.
Thank you.
Very
Great
good.
to see you all.
Thank you.
Great to see you.
Excellent.
Bye-bye.